Okay. James Stewart, everybody. A big round of applause. James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Is this on? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. My first time in Greece. I'm planning to stay for the weekend. Really looking forward to that, but also really glad to be here with you today. I'm going to be telling a story about a journey that I went on in the UK government starting in about 2011. I was there for 6 years, left a year and a half ago, and was involved in bringing about some massive change across a very large organisation. And a big part of the message that was founding that is this one, that the internet is okay. It was about setting the UK government up to operate more effectively in the internet era, using the processes, practices, tools, technologies, and culture that we've seen emerge from the best of the internet and bringing them to the heart of government. We started, and my clicker's not working, so I'm going to go over by my laptop. It started with this website. This was a prototype of a new single website for the UK government, which we launched in May 2011. Built by a small team. There were about 12 of us in total, and arguably didn't even need that many people. It ended up somewhere much bigger. We're over 3 years from 2012 to 2015. Through the application of a number of change methods, we saved the UK government £4.1 billion. But that's the headline. For me, the more exciting things lie elsewhere in our journey. This really isn't working. We weren't there to help government innovate. When a new small team comes into an organisation like a government, it's very easy to label them as the new innovation lab, innovation squad, whatever you want to call it. We weren't there to do that. We weren't there to lead an agile transformation. We used Agile, but our goal wasn't Agile. We weren't there to introduce DevOps or any of a range of technology practices that we harnessed. We also weren't there to focus on those big numbers, that 4.1 billion. We were there to make public services in the UK substantially better. We were there because the UK government had a track record of massive failure at delivering crucial services. The most immediate story that people in the UK remember from before we started was that a project that was meant to link together all of the data in our healthcare service, which had been forecast to cost about £2 billion, ended up costing £12 billion and didn't deliver anything. That sort of failure erodes confidence. That sort of failure damages the ability of governments to do their jobs. And we were there to affect that. We applied all of these other methods in service of it. These days, I work with a consultancy called Public Digital. We work with other governments around the world who are going on similar journeys, and with a lot of large, often regulated organizations, because most of them have the same challenges. Earlier this year, we brought together teams from, I think, about 12 different governments for an event at the Harvard Kennedy School. And many of their experiences, while they're not part of my immediate story, chime with this. And I'd really encourage you to go and seek out some videos that we're about to publish to see how this sort of story plays out in other places. But as I said, before we started, public sector technology in the UK, and I think this is true around most of the world, had been synonymous with failure. We'd also outsourced most of our thinking about how to implement services. As our services became more and more dependent on technology, we also handed all of our technology expertise and all of our delivery expertise out to a very small number of suppliers. Right around the time we started, the UK Parliament published this report which looked at the fact that there were 4 or 5 companies who really owned almost all of the supply chain for the crucial technology that underpinned UK government services. Described it as an oligopoly. I don't know that we have many economists in the room or theorists of that area, but an oligopoly is effectively the last stop on the way to a cartel. This was a very strong statement for a parliament to make, a very strong criticism of some... Yeah, good. So in that context, a new government came in. We had a general election. We'd had one government for 13 years. We got a new government. And they very quickly commissioned a report looking at how we delivered services online. And they commissioned a woman called Martha Lane Fox, who is known in the UK as the founder of lastminute.com. She's now a member of the House of Lords, but at this point she was an advisor to the government. And she was the one who coined this term, revolution, not evolution. She looked at the fact that UK government had been fairly quick to grasp some of the possibilities of the internet, but we'd never really taken seriously the challenge of this new mode that people had of interacting with their government and putting it right at the heart of how we worked. By outsourcing our expertise, we'd made that impossible for ourselves. And we had to revolutionize that. We had to turn it around if we were to keep pace with the changing expectations people had of us. So Martha made 4 recommendations. She recommended that we create a new centre of digital skills, expertise, and power at the centre of government. That we fix publishing. We look at the way that the government puts information online, move from the immensely confusing array of websites that were all different, often overlapping, and required citizens to understand government in order to find the information they wanted, bring that together in a user-centric way. That we then fix the transactional services that people use, things like paying your tax, things like getting a driving license. And then beyond that, that we go wholesale. And by that she meant that we make data available so that other people can build on top of government services, but also that we spread out from that new centre and make sure that there are new skills and capabilities right across the system. And today I'm going to talk through a few things that were really important building blocks for us on that journey and that helped us with what I believe was quite significant success. And the first of those is purpose. I think there's been a recurring theme through today's talks about understanding what we're trying to achieve beyond just talking about how do we bring Agile into an organization, how do we do transformation. Instead, it's really important that we understand the bigger purpose that any sort of change is trying to achieve. And beyond that, the purpose that the organizations that we're trying to change were set up for. So for us, that meant really taking seriously understanding the role that government played in society, the ways that people needed it, the roles that different organizations within government held and what they saw their purpose as, and then understanding our purpose within that, which wasn't to change any of those fundamentals. It wasn't to shift the role of government. It wasn't to remove services. It was to help deliver things better. We embedded that in a number of ways, and we were very strong on producing sets of principles. These were the 10 core principles that drove how we approached everything we did. And they made real impact across government as teams all over the place took these and adopted them. And there was a really exciting kind of organic adoption of these principles, as well as some harder controls that I'm going to talk about later. But the first thing that we did wasn't to introduce those principles. It wasn't to spread out. It was to really focus on this website. So this, sorry, I'm really lost without my clicker. This, as I mentioned earlier, was a very quick prototype of what a single government website could look like, an answer to that fixed publishing challenge that Martha had given us. After we launched it, we very quickly built a team that responded to the fact that the government ministers loved it, that the public seemed to love it, and built out what became gov.uk, which is a single government website for the whole of the central government in the UK. And we did that by building a new institution at the heart of government. We founded it on a lot of slogans, those design principles that I talked about, and some very tight, multidisciplinary Agile teams. And when I say multidisciplinary, I think I'm talking slightly differently from some of the other talks I've heard today. Because for me, multidisciplinary is not test and dev, and perhaps some ops. It's design, it's policy, it's legal, it's commercial, it's everybody who needs to be involved in delivering the right things for the right people. And so we built a set of teams looking like that built out gov.uk and spent a lot of time with their users. We insisted that absolutely everybody on those multidisciplinary teams sat in on what we call the user research session at least every 6 weeks. And we iterated constantly based on that user feedback. We put a lot of emphasis on making sure those teams were autonomous, but that their decisions were rooted in what they saw from those observations of users trying the products they were making and users expressing their frustrations and showing us their problems. And the result looked very different from where we started, because one of the things that we learned is that that kind of shiny picture of the Olympic Stadium and all of these things that you'd normally send as signals that government's doing big, shiny, exciting things, just distracted people from what they needed to do. In fact, we very consciously removed that picture of the stadium very early on, but we constantly were pulling things out. And we had a very proud moment when the Daily Mail, a fairly notorious British newspaper, published an article referring to gov.uk as boring.com. We thought that was they didn't realise it, but we thought that was the best praise they could give us. Government websites shouldn't be exciting. They should get you the information you need fast. But starting with a website accomplished 2 things. One is that it got us in touch with a lot of users very fast, because almost everybody's interaction with government starts with a website. And that data that you get from being that first port of call that people have is immensely powerful. And it puts us in a very strong position for the influence that we needed to have across the rest of government. We're able to draw on deep insight into what people needed of government because we saw their search queries, we saw where they went, we saw which bits of content confused them, which didn't, which services they started and then backed out and went somewhere else. Now, it's not about surveillance state, in case you're wondering. We weren't using it to track individual users, but we could see where the problems were in a really powerful way. And we used that to publish a government digital strategy to shape what the next response should be. But a really important point in that is that we didn't publish a strategy until after we'd shipped something. We weren't in a position to say this is what government should do as a whole until we'd proved that it's possible to do things in a different way. It's very, very easy to get up and advocate for Agile, for a more user-centered design approach, for doing all sorts of different methodologies within an organization like government. But the first thing you're likely to be met with is disbelief. But by showing that this could be done, we were able to counter that disbelief from day one and use the data that came from that, the experiences that came from that, to shape a strategy that actually met where the real problems were. And people seemed to like it. That was nice. We were the first website ever to win the UK's most prestigious design award, Design of the Year, given by the Design Museum. That was pretty exciting. It was the year after London hosted the Olympics, and we beat out all of the Olympic venues and the architecture and sculpture that was produced for that. That was pretty exciting. I live by the Olympic Park, and there's some pretty great buildings there, but apparently our website was better. When we won that award, we made a point of tying it into a much wider narrative. Because it was really easy for our team to take that award and say, aren't we great? We can win this design award. Nobody else in government can do that. But instead, we'd taken some time to look back at the history of delivery across the civil service. Looking back to the mid-19th century when the sewage system was installed in London. A massive public works project that was a really important response to the circumstances of that time, just as getting better at the internet is an important response to the circumstances of our time. But the people who produced it not only managed this amazing feat of civil engineering, but they took time to make sure that some of the visible artifacts of that, and this is a pumping station in South London, were beautiful buildings. They really took pride in that work. And they wanted the public to take pride in it too. There's actually this incredible tradition of improving the country and doing things that are beautiful and fundamentally important, that lives within the British civil service. And connecting to that, and connecting that with our design award, was a really important part of saying not only is it possible for us, these newcomers, these kids in jeans, to ship a better government website, but actually we're just remembering what we used to be good at. Digital actually gave us a chance to reclaim some of those values in history, and this deliberate attempt to get better at something that sort of used to be good at anyway came in. And there are lots of other examples of this, from things like trying to understand how you manage the register of land across the UK, where we found that when all deeds were held on paper, the staff in the land registry learned to tie very special knots to knot them together, which were actually almost an early cryptographic signature on those documents to show who had last looked at them, who had last changed them, and using that as part of telling the story about some of the new methods that we wanted to bring in. One of the wonderful things about working with very old organizations is that they are full of that kind of history and those kinds of stories, which can be a really useful tool to harness when you're thinking about how they should change without losing their core purpose. From doing that website and publishing that strategy, we moved on to take on 25 different major projects across government. That was partnering with 8 different departments on 25 of their services that needed to be reimagined from the ground up. It was things like how do you pay your tax? How do you get a student loan? How do you tax your vehicle? How do you get a driver's license? Huge number of different, very important services. And it was interesting listening to Dave Snowden this morning, because one of the things that we really found there was that we had to adjust our template, that we had to really reflect on why some of the things we'd done before had worked and recontextualize them or sometimes change them to apply them in these very diverse settings. And we had some big challenges because we had to scale the organization massively to do this piece of work. And we got a lot of people who'd seen the surface of what we were doing and not really seen the work that we'd done to contextualize the way we approached the work. And so a number of our most challenging situations were where people had gone and tried to replicate a method that they'd seen working for other people. And a number of us who'd been there at the start had to get into those situations going, no. We don't have to do it exactly the same way. We have to stick to the same principles. We can adapt how we're approaching this problem. We don't have to start with the user interface. We don't have to apply this strict approach to sprints. We have to really understand where is the complexity in this and what the user needs. Of those 25, about 18 succeeded. The ones that didn't were for varying reasons, but they were often quite political. And the most extreme was one where we found that the team behind it had been so used to their service failing repeatedly that before we even started, they just started on this journey of preparing for the next failure. And all of our showing that we could do things differently in other places didn't work there. I don't know what I'd do differently if I went back to that. I probably wouldn't go back. Sometimes on this kind of a journey, you have to just write some things off and focus on where you can actually succeed. Because overall, this sort of change is probably a 20-year process, and this is within our first couple of years. But we were able to show some really tangible results from the things that worked. So this is one called Carer's Allowance. It's a benefit that you can get if you spend more than 35 hours a week looking after a disabled or otherwise unable to look after themselves relative. And through really just redesigning the front end of this service, we didn't need to do all that much on the back end to start with. We were able to reduce the ineligible claims that people were making through the service by 41%. That took a lot of money out of the system, saved people a lot of time and frustration. The user completion rate went up from 61% to 83%, and that was through a very iterative process of every week looking at the stats, looking at where people drop off, and shipping something that addressed that particular issue. And over not many weeks, I think it was about 12 weeks, they saw this turnaround. And really fundamentally for changing the organization, we got to a point where 91% of the staff whose jobs was to answer the phone to support that service were willing to recommend the digital service instead, even though it put their jobs in question. Because they could see that this was significantly better, it made people's lives better, the people whose stories they were hearing on those phone calls, and it let them really focus on the small number of cases that needed direct human support. In the process, we were starting to introduce some things that looked a lot more like the sorts of lean, agile concepts that are talked about today. So this diagram shows, up at the top, the old way that everything was done in government. You'd spend a lot of time on policy formation. Some very smart people would sit in a room with some economic models and come up with some assumptions and write them in policy and have a government minister announce them. And maybe they might talk to somebody about it, but a lot of the time they wouldn't bother. You'd then capture a lot of requirements. This is where you spent most of your time. And in procurement, you'd go to one of your friends in the big four companies and you'd commission them to do the work. You'd develop it, you'd release it. And who knows if it would work. Worst example I can think of is an identity system for some benefits, which had had millions of pounds spent on it, and 2 people were able to successfully sign up without needing to phone for help. But that was seen as success because it was delivered on time and on budget. So, it must have been fine. Instead, we introduced this new process. And personally, I had misgivings about even laying out a structured process because I felt like it might cramp our iterative style. But in an organization like government, providing some clarity about what the new expectations are is really important. And we put 4 stages. Discovery. This is where you start with an understanding of what are you looking to achieve as an organization, and then go and try and understand what do users actually need that coincides with that. You work out some hypotheses, you start to test them, you might do some prototyping, but you start to understand the boundaries of this service that you need to deliver. Alpha, you make those prototypes a bit more real, get them in front of a lot more people, start to understand how they might need to integrate with other systems and processes. Beta is where you start to scale it up. And live doesn't mean you're done, it means it's alive. It means it's living and needs to keep evolving and changing, but that people are going to rely on it. And the really important bit in this is the arrows. And really, if we wanted to draw this in a way that would confuse people but was more accurate, there'd be a lot more arrows. Because this can look like an incremental process, and parts of it are incremental. But it wasn't really about being incremental, it was about being iterative. Because we were constantly learning more things about our users and what they needed, and at any point, any of our assumptions could be proved wrong, and we'd need to be able to change. And to support this, we worked very hard at being as open as we possibly could. Talk before lunch focused a lot on transparency. That was absolutely fundamental to how we were working. That was transparency within government, but also publicly. So everything we did, we blogged about. And we made sure that other people could see it and comment on it, because we're part of a much wider network. We put dashboards showing service performance up everywhere, even in 10 Downing Street, because government ministers and senior officials need to see the reality of the services that they're offering. And that was all part of saying that in order to do this well, you need an open culture. You need to move away from the closed-off ways that we had of doing things. You need an open supply chain. You need a much more diverse range of people you can draw on. You need to be open about what you're trying to achieve, because unless you do that, then your team aren't going to be able to give you the intelligence you need to get to the right goals. You need to be open with the public as much as you can, and this applies in companies as well as in governments, because you really want to tap into the intelligence of all the networks around us. And you need to be open to being challenged all along the way. So this is our team at one point. It was... we did a lot of celebrating. So this is us all getting together to celebrate, I think, the first anniversary of the launch of gov.uk. There was a lot of cake, Cake was a really important thing for us. Badges, posters, all kinds of frivolous seeming things. But they were the other side of that openness about what we're trying to achieve, was really celebrating when we did achieve even small steps towards it. And part of the power that came from this open culture was its connections with people outside. So some of the foundations for what we've been doing were laid by an organization called My Society, which is a charity. This is Tom Steinberg, who founded it. They'd been advocating from outside government for a long time for the sorts of change that we were then there to make. But their continuing challenge and friendship was vital. Similarly, we were able to connect with some networks that had existed within government before us. TCamp was a kind of, I think, monthly get-together of mostly comms people, but digitally minded people who, they know the internet, who got together to talk about government regularly. They were civil servants. GovCamp was an annual unconference for government web people. We embraced those communities. A number of people from them came and worked with us. We made sure we went and talked at their gatherings regularly, because a lot of the power to bring about change comes from the people who are already there and already dissatisfied and already looking to do things in a different way. And also a lot of the insight about what your obstacles are going to be. And so connecting into that network was vital. And that really came to mind when I read this blog post by Dan North back in January, where he was talking about swarming. This is really partly his angry response to some of the scaled Agile methodologies, which have already been criticized a number of times today. But he picked out some examples to talk about how really to make change last, you need this groundswell of enthusiasm. And if it's already there and just looking for a home, give it a home. Seek out those people. Because the next thing that you need is friends. These journeys are hard. Large organizations have all kinds of curious networks, curious processes, mythologies within them. And it's only through being part of a network that's looking at those things that you can really start to cut through that. So along our journey, we then needed to really get serious about encountering some of the big machinery of government. And this is where a lot of the big savings came from. There'd been another team evolving alongside us called the IT Reform Group, and they came and merged with our organization. And they were operating a set of IT spend controls. So they had got to a place where the Treasury in the UK had delegated them the power to stop any technology spending over £1 million and to stop any digital spending, meaning anything that sort of directly touched the public, in this case, over £100,000. And by our example of how you can do things differently and that control, we were able to do a huge amount to stop the self-harm that was running right through how government did technology. We're also able to look at things like how do we provide better laptops for people who work in government. Ones that they can put stickers on. That was nice because, we spread our word through stickers. But also just tools that made it easier for them to work. And our minister, Francis Maud, often would say that there's no reason that people shouldn't have IT as good at work as they have at home. Which is, a complete turnaround from when we first put technology in governments and nobody had computers at home. But now we needed to sort of start saying that if we want people to be part of this change, they need good tools and they need to connect their work experience with the best of what they see elsewhere. Along with those spending controls, we put in a service standard. These are 18 points. There were actually 26 when we started. These are the kind of hallmarks of this is what a good service looks like. And they embedded those design principles that we had, and we would assess the larger services of government at those points of end of discovery, end of alpha, end of beta, and going into live. We did it ourselves within our team to start with, and then we started bringing in other good practitioners from across government to be part of that assessment process. And with it, we started to gradually eat away at some of the really arcane governance processes that existed out there by showing that we took governance seriously, but we needed to set up governance differently. And it needed to be about showing the thing. So the only pre-reading material that you got for doing one of these assessments was a URL. That was the URL to see the service on the web. No other paperwork. Everything else you could ask about later. You had to see that the product worked. And you can see point 18 here, which was point 26 of the old one. You also had to get the government minister responsible for the service to use it before it could go live. Because if they couldn't make it work, then none of the other people in the country could be expected to make it work. As I said, we had to start taking governance seriously, and there's loads of stories I could do. Long talk about this, and I touched on it a bit in the panel. Reforming the security environment was a really important part of what we did. Working with colleagues who were already deeply embedded in the cybersecurity machinery of government. We took away a lot of the policies and a lot of the controls, because policies and controls on security had taken the place of expertise. So we put some checklists that made sense at the time in place, and then people thought, well, we don't need specialists anymore, we've got a checklist. Truth is, you need both, but the best way to change that culture was to get rid of the current checklist in our context. Don't necessarily apply that where you are, but it's a tool you can try. And we were also on a journey of adopting cloud services, and the way that we were marking documents and saying what's secret and what's not was a real block to that and was leading to bad security practices. So we worked with some other colleagues to actually completely change the security classification scheme. And while this may look like a fairly simple, sort of just a list of words, the cultural impact of changing something like that had been there since World War II was immense. And most significantly, this new official tier, which replaced unclassified, protected, restricted, and confidential, was all oriented around individuals taking responsibility for how they handle information. We're not going to give you really strict compartments. We're going to expect you to write official and then say why something in it might be sensitive, so that the next person understands the context, not just, oh, it's confidential, so I can't use Trello, or that sort of conversation, which happened far more than it should. We also worked a lot on supply chain. As I said, we'd been subject to this oligopoly of government IT suppliers. We put in new procurement mechanisms that let us buy commodity technology services as commodities, not through complex tendering processes, and bring in specialists much more quickly. One of the really exciting things about that, and this maps the UK, it's actually worked, I think, for some other suppliers outside the UK, but we saw the government technology supply chain move from being in 4 places in the UK, mostly the offices of a number of companies that you can probably guess, to being spread out all over the country. So it had a huge impact on local economies. That's a part of the story that we've not told very much, but was really important. But all of those things are what I'd call the basics. This isn't great, innovative new services. This isn't bringing the latest technology into government or cutting-edge practices. It's about saying we should be able to buy things in a sensible way. We should actually make them secure, not just comply with something that's been there since World War II. We should be able to have smart people working in teams, and we should understand how our services are performing. The basics. It's really tempting when you're going on a big change or transformation project to focus on the shiny, to focus on the blockchain, to focus on all of those other things that people are excited about. The truth is, if you want to make a real impact, you need to fix the basics. You need to get those building blocks in place, and you need to show the organizations that they can deliver in that setting. So those are 5 of my kind of key lessons that I've taken, and 5 things that, from what I've seen working across the UK government, but also globally, and in a number of large companies, apply pretty much all the time. We need to understand why we're there, why the organization's there, what we're really trying to achieve. We need to show that doing things in a different way is possible, and not just that consultants can do it differently, but that people in those organizations can do it differently. You need to do that with an open culture and be really deliberate about the way you're seeding culture. You need to find friends, and you need to fix the basics. And through all of that, and this came up earlier as well, it's absolutely vital to stay focused, because these journeys are big and complicated, and it's very easy to get sucked in. For us, that was really about this, not just the mantra, but the practice of focusing on user needs. In our office, we're above this junction, so we put this sign on the window encouraging us all to look out, because even just doing that reminded us of who we were doing this for. The practice of everybody observing user research at least every 6 weeks. And more importantly, the deliberate effort to then connect that back to what overall are we trying to achieve? And does that even chime with what we're hearing from our users? And can we iterate our software and iterate our processes and iterate everything else to get there? Was fundamental. And however much we were getting busy with the structural reforms and other things, if it wasn't achieving this, it was wrong, and we had to come back to this. Just to wrap up, I really like this quote from William Gibson recently, which I'm not going to read out, but I think it speaks to me of the challenge that some of us took on when we went on this journey with government. And it's really not just about government, because we are entering times when the world is changing very rapidly, and we don't know what's going to happen. We're seeing political turbulence, we're seeing all sorts of questions about future employment, all of these other things. And one of the things we're really going to need is institutions that can adapt. We need the new, we need the startups, but we also need some of the stability of our societies to be able to adapt to the changing conditions that they find themselves in. I think that's the real challenge for all of us, to bring all of this understanding of software and agile processes and all of these other things to bear on making sure that the institutions that ought to last are able to adapt and are able to last. So thanks very much. I hope that's been useful to you. If you want to know more, there's a book. I'm happy to take questions.
James, did you say there's a book?
Yeah, there is a book. This one, Digital Transformation at Scale, Why the Strategy is Delivery. It's written by 4 of my colleagues at Public Digital, but I stand behind everything they say. And actually this picture on the front is a rubber stamp that we would use to stamp post-it notes or cards for any stories that we'd finished when we were developing things. That was a fun little ritual.
James, thank you for that talk. I can identify with a lot of that. I used to work for the British government, so I recall writing a little note or a note that big about an emergency response situation that we needed to get done, and it was marked as unclassified but sensitive. And then the security policy changed, and it was marked as restricted, and I wasn't allowed to view the document that I wrote.
Yeah, that's why
when I was asked to renew the document a year later, I went to the file to retrieve the document, and the clerk at the door said, "You're not allowed to see that document." Once I wrote that document. Anyway, so yeah, glad to see that it's evolved.
Yes.
I'm no longer there, thankfully, but I wish I had stayed, because it seems like it's evolved positively. Very good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
There was a very complex project around
Absolutely.
replacing IT to embassies. I don't know
Well,
how that's going.
I'm a product of my story is I was tasked with making myself obsolete,
Right.
and it was fantastic because it gave me my the next chapter in my life, which I'm very happy to be part of, which is this community. So, questions of James? Yes.
Hi, thank you for the lovely talk. From what you described, I imagine this was a multi-modular type of software involving many different teams. What was the structure of these teams? How were the UX and research people distributed in relation to these teams?
Yeah, so I think the layer that I've talked about this at, we were fairly open to lots of different structures and organisations of teams. So I can talk about gov.uk in a minute, but what we really focused on for the rest of government was laying out a lot more the outcomes that we expected of them. And we gave some guidance on team structures, but that ability to responsibly operate your service and to iterate it, those were the sorts of things that we said they had to comply with. It wasn't for us to then determine the exact structure of their team. And a lot of their software was, completely independent. So you might reuse some components, but the code that runs the tax system is going to be very different from the code that runs the publishing system. And so we kind of kept responsibility for the structure of that and the technology choices very local to whoever was responsible for that particular system. For gov.uk and for the other things that we built within Government Digital Service, what we aimed for was that we would have a team that would have a product manager, and I know Mark's going to talk a bit about product owners in a bit, so see what he has to say on that. A delivery manager who would run the Agile ceremonies, make sure the team was functioning well, remove blockers for them. We'd have some tech people, a designer. We made sure that all of our visual designers had some amount of coding skills, at least for HTML, CSS kind of end of things, so that they'd be prototyping in browser rather than handing over designs. A user researcher, and often various types of analysts, or if it was touching on a new policy area, a policy person, legal, and so on. And then we let the teams very much work out how they wanted to work. So even down to which bits of which Agile methodologies do they choose, because it was up to them to deliver effectively. And so long as they could clearly express what they were trying to achieve and whether they were achieving it, we didn't really want to impose much more on them. Since then, as Gov.uk's got a bit bigger, they introduced a concept of quarterly missions. So they'd have some core teams that were just iterating the core product, and then these kind of time-boxed 3-month, can we make a substantial improvement to some part of the product? I've heard mixed reports. That's mostly since I left. I've heard mixed reports about how that's worked. I think it works well for some things, and for others it's a slightly arbitrary way of doing it.
I'll take a few more. We have some time, yes. I could talk to James all day. That'll bring up a lot of pain. Where are we? Here we are.
Hello, James. I would like to touch upon the themes of culture and friends. I have a question with regards to continuity in the government environment, and how much disruption do you get from elections, of having to work with new stakeholders that are not chosen by a CEO, let's say, and but have a complete new mindset, and that you have to convince them that the methods that you follow, that the culture that you have established is working. And of course, yes, the 4.1 billion is a tangible result, but apart from that, do you have any tips to share?
Yeah, so I think that's yet another of those areas where it's tempting to look at government and say that it's quite different from corporations. But the average tenure of a CEO has been going down, and I don't think it's that much different from of a government minister at this point. At least UK government ministers. Been working with some Latin American countries recently where the ministers change a lot more regularly. Most of the day-to-day decisions in government, at least in our structure, are not made by politicians. They're made by permanent civil servants. And by the time people get to the very senior roles, they tend to stay in that role for at least several years, which helps a lot with the continuity. And with understanding who some of those stakeholders are and where you're at with them. And I mean, you can see it from, there are many, many examples across all governments of programs that long outlive the government that initiated them. So it can be tempting to slightly overstate that challenge. You have more continuity in that system than sometimes it seems. Where we had more challenge was where we needed government ministers to support us in changing fundamental parts of the system. So enforcing those spending controls or changing that security policy or that kind of thing that really needed that politician, senior leader involvement. And we were really lucky that the first 5 years of this piece of work we had one minister. And not only that, but he was a minister who'd been in government previously. So where the average minister comes in, they know nothing about how government works. And so it takes them months and months to be effective. He knew what he wanted and he knew how to get it done in government. That is something that I probably should have put into the story. Finding those kind of senior operators who know that something needs to change and also really understand the system, enormously powerful. More recently, I think that there's a story that can be told about if you're a new government minister, agility is exactly the sort of thing that you want, because you may not be in post for very long and you want to have something tangible to show, not just that you commissioned something that cost tens of millions of pounds and hasn't been delivered yet. So that's a thing to play on, is that let us work this way because you might actually see a result before you go to your next job.
I think that might be an awesome talk in itself, to talk to potential new ministers how you can, hack the system really quickly and produce solutions really quickly.
Yeah.
That might be an interesting thing to.
Actually, with our consultancy, that's some of what we do is working with ministers and equivalents.
But I'll bet the organizations and the oligopoly that lost out on the 4.1 billion were pissed.
Some of them.
Yeah.
It was interesting. So one of the things that I think I mentioned earlier, but that really I find constantly, is that any time you've lumped a group together as a group, you'll find that you've missed something, that it's reductive. And even with those 4 or 5 big suppliers, their attitudes to what we were doing differed massively. So their behaviours previously had been very similar. But some of them realised that the trends that we represented were trends that were playing out across the world, and that they had no choice but to adapt as businesses, and having us as customers who would help them on that journey was really useful. Others tried to get meetings with the Prime Minister to complain about us.
Yeah, well, great. It's good that even the governments themselves, or at least the operators within government, the middle level that's executing stuff, are understanding that seeing as their budgets are being minimized year after year after year, that they need to seek value for money, and if you keep having the same suppliers, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And
when the cabinet secretary is going to you and saying you need to shave 10% off your budget next year, and you have no idea how, and we come along going, this is how. That's attractive.
I had the experience of working for the government for 17 years, and every year I had that conversation about shaving my budget by 10%. So you try and achieve as much of 10% as you can.
Yeah.
10% over 17 years it's not something that you can do, of course, but it really does make you think about getting value, extracting value. I'll take a few more. We have 5 minutes before coffee, unless you want to break for coffee right now if we don't have any more. And if we don't, there's one down here. Oh, there we are.
Thanks for the talk. So I'm sure your teams had a lot of dependencies across other government agencies. So how did you help them get around these dependencies?
So part of the joy of starting with something like gov.uk is that it meant there weren't really any technical dependencies there, which helped a lot. The dependencies were much more on content. We ended up scaling our team quite significantly on the kind of people who would go and run workshops with all of the different web teams around government, and then all of the relevant policy teams and others, to help them understand the user needs driven methodology, and also how to write really good content for the web, and then do the mapping of how does that content translate into what's going to exist on gov.uk. So a lot of that was throwing people at the problem, which is very rarely what I encourage people to do. I think we probably had a pretty lean team given the scale of what we were doing, but you just needed people to deal with some of that. Over time, what we tried to move towards was, we used this phrase, publish, don't send. And that was because we were finding that people live in their inboxes, and you're responding to every stakeholder individually about mostly the same things. And the more we could just publish something on a website, this is the status update, this is the roadmap, and here's the session where we can come and discuss that. And here's the evidence that underpins why these things are being prioritized when they are. The simpler some of that became, because you could carve off quite a lot of the dependencies just by being transparent. Later on, we got into things which had more technical dependencies as well. I think we tried to, as much as possible, just keep simplifying, just keep reducing those dependencies, but sometimes they're just hard. And you just play every option in your playbook to handle it.
No more? Oh, we do. Here we are. John.
So I want to ask, how did you introduce UX research into those projects?
So what we did, so for the 25, which are kind of the ones where we're most directly doing that, the formation of that digital strategy was done really quickly by government timescales. It was 2 or 3 months that we put it together, but that involved a lot of time with those 8 departments who were responsible for those services, really carefully picking those services. You know, probably not carefully enough, but 18 of them worked, so that's not a bad hit rate. And mostly finding the ones that were at the right moment in their cycle. So people knew that something had to change, or that a contract was coming to an end, or a new team needed to be formed, so that we could be there kind of at the inception of that, which removed a lot of the friction that would have come with jumping in to something that was already well underway. There were a few things that I had to get involved in because they were failing. And a lot of the time, that was about getting alongside the top leaders on those things who knew that something wasn't right. Because most of the time they knew that, like, the rollout of that big system, we're not getting the information we want from our team, or there's a lot of risk that the team don't seem to be taking seriously. And I think we made sure that we had enough people in our team who could kind of speak the language of those leaders and also speak the language of the team members. Or at least we'd pair people up so that we could cover that, so that we could kind of bridge some of those gaps. And that was often quite an effective strategy. Though sometimes it got hard, and there were, you know, people that we had to move on, and there were all those kinds of messy things to deal with. But that's starting with trying to find where, do they already know there's a problem, in which case let's show them that we can help solve it, was the place to start, even if you then had to resort to more drastic measures later.
James, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much for that very interesting talk. Hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend in Athens.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Let's have a talk later on. I'll tell you some of the quick hacks about the off-the-beaten track touristic site you should visit. Fantastic.